Hello everybody, this is my girlfriend's mother's battle-scarred 2007 Toyota Avensis, and I have recently become the temporary custodian of this fine motor vehicle. I thought while it was in my possession that it would be remiss of me not to do a video on it for a couple of good reasons. First off, this is a very good example of the kind of car that people were still buying en masse about 15 years ago, and there are both good and bad things about that. Secondly, not only does my girlfriend's family own this car, but they have in fact had it from brand new. And in those 14 years, this car has covered just shy of 140,000 miles. And this seems like a perfect example of car to use to try and put to bed that most awful of motoring cliches, the one careful lady owner. Way back when the free ads was still a thing, it was a common buzz phrase, selling a car, one careful lady owner, as if that actually made any difference at all. I think it's a terribly sexist statement. After all, I know plenty of women, and they are equally as capable of trashing a car as they are looking after it. I don't think it really makes any difference. This car is here to prove a point that it doesn't really matter too much who owns the car, or more specifically what gender they may associate with, but rather where the car has been. I have owned plenty of cars of this age and mileage, and none have been quite as tatty as this. And the reasoning is simple. This car has lived the majority of its life in London. And you park anything on the streets of London, and in the following morning, it'll either not be there, or it won't be quite the same shape as when you parked it up. Allow me to give you a little tour. The number plate appears to have taken some small arms fire. Hard to see, but the paint also bears the swirl marks of 1,000 very cheap washes. All of the alloys have a nice even and consistent curbing all the way around. I don't know what terrible secrets this piece of black tape is trying to hide, but I daren't remove it lest I find something entirely horrifying. At the back, the bumper has decided that it wants to form a separate state and has begun the process of breaking away from the motherland. If that isn't the mark from a tow bar, it's somebody with a golf ball that got very angry. Obviously, the corner is scuffed up, but that was probably only done to try and match the damage on this side. I think that's a good demonstration of the swirliness of the paint. There are a number of unidentifiable marks on the back, some of which I think are tree sap. The others, I don't want to know. Until recently, your view at the back was cut in two by a piece of trim slowly making its way down, until last week it just came off entirely and refuses to go back on. And if you forgot where your fuel filler flap is, you merely follow this handy trail all the way there. As you can see, this car isn't in terrible condition, but it's certainly far from A1. Now, what makes this such a typical slice of noughties motoring? Well, first off, the form factor. It's a saloon, or at least that's what it looks like. What Toyota actually call this is a liftback, which means the whole tailgate comes up, revealing a boot that's actually pretty big. In fact, so is the entire car. I know it won't look like it, but I parked this next to my 1 Series and it towered over it. This is a pretty decently sized car. You could also get a traditional saloon and an estate as well. And back then people were still buying cars like this. The whole hatchback thing hadn't entirely taken over. And then it sadly was only about another decade until people went absolutely mad for crossovers, leaving cars like this somewhat unloved. The other thing marking this car out as a product of its time is its choice of engine. Of course, it's a diesel, because in 2007, everyone was going absolutely mad for diesels. No matter what you used your car for, that's what people wanted. Old Mabel, who lives down the road, does 2 miles a month, she wanted a diesel, because everyone had been told it was cheaper and better. And look how well that turned out. This 2-litre common rail injection lump produces a measly 125 horsepower and about 229 pound-feet of torque. It is at least relatively economical, but that's about the only good thing I can say about it, because it's noisy, it's rattly, it has absolutely no go whatsoever below 2,000 RPM, and it's all round a fairly hateful lump. It's in here that you really get a sense of what this car truly is, and the sort of identity crisis that Toyota seemed to have been undergoing at the time, because this car has elements of both very cheap and also very nice cars. Sometimes it's the little details, like the fact that all of these windows, which are electric, are also automatic both down and up. And that's something you wouldn't tend to get on, say, a BMW 3 or a 5 Series. They'll reserve that for the 7. You also have a sat-nav screen here, which tilts and folds out and still works. It will even play not just MP3s, but WMA files as well. Ooh! But you don't have Bluetooth in this car at all. You don't have an aux in. You do have dual zone climate control. You've even got some buttons on the steering wheel to change the stereo station. You've got cruise control, which is nice, but these stalks all feel more sort of 1990s Japanese. They remind me more of my Celica than any current Toyota product. The dash equally, there's a little bit of chrome bezel on there to try and make it look fancy, but the backlight is this very sickly yellow, which is quite problematic because the fuel light is constantly illuminated yellow, and you'll catch glimpses of it and think, oh, I must be on my reserve. No, it's just yellow all the time. There's some storage in here too, like the little cubby on top of the dash. But these seats, again, they feel quite cheap, although they've worn their miles extremely well. This driver's side seat feels almost brand new. They are manual, not electric, and you have, most curiously, still a manual gearbox in here. Many a motorway cruiser now would, of course, be automatic, but back then, diesel engine, manual gearbox, that was just the way of the world. And a 6-speed too, which then was not a given either. So really, a bit of a mixed bag in the Toyota. I think it would be very fair to say that my girlfriend's family aren't really car people at all. To them, this is merely an appliance, and I don't think you can really hold anything against them for that. It's that kind of car, isn't it? They bought it expressly to get them from London to Scotland and back again in comfort and with relatively decent fuel economy, and it does that job very well. Now, they're not the best people at looking after cars, but they certainly haven't skimped on the maintenance. Whenever this car's needed something, it has been done. But I think it's equally fair to say that no real preventative maintenance or cosmetic work has ever really happened to this car. To give you an example of the kind of fixes it's had, recently it developed a power steering fluid leak. It got taken to a garage who fixed it, and their fix was to cut the leaky pipe in half and put in a new section. It then started leaking from the join, and when I got it home, it decorated my driveway in power steering fluid. I couldn't really let that go on, so I fixed the problem to a cost of over £300. So when this car is in of itself worth less than £1,000, having been just under 20 grand when it was new, you've got to ask yourself, is this a car that would still be worth buying now, or is it genuinely at the end of its life? To answer that question, I suppose we need to take it for a drive. So let's go. I remember 2007 as a car person very well, because it was the first full year where I had a license, having been qualified in December of 2006. This common rail diesel engine was a fairly new thing at the time, and they operated at pressures, I think, of something like 25,000 psi. Absolutely mad, really impressive. And some of them have turned out to be quite durable, like this Toyota lump. Durability, however, is one of the few nice things I can say about this engine, because it doesn't really have a lot of other redeeming features. It is geared quite long, and that's led to more than one amusing moment where I've realised I'm going down the motorway in third or fourth. Having an S2000 on the driveway will kind of warp your idea as to what cruising RPM should actually be. It's a fairly noisy power plant too, very agricultural and van-like, and not really upmarket whatsoever. Toyota makes some of the finest petrol engines in the world, and it's absolutely maddening now to think that people would choose one of these over one of those. But all we cared about was lower tax and fuel economy, and that's what these gave us. On fuel, it's actually been reasonably good, because it has, according to its trip computer, averaged 50.8 miles to the gallon over the last 8,000 miles. That's pretty good for a full-size car. And it does feel like a big thing in here too. Not only is it pretty big on the driveway, but you feel like you're very high up, even with the seat as low down as it will go. The Avensis is a big car. I rented one of these a few years ago, and I remember feeling the same way. You felt way higher up than you imagined you would be. What that gives you is a very good view of the road, and there are things to really like about this car. The steering, actually pretty good. This car's a lot nippier than you might think, turns into corners really well, and if you want to hustle it, you actually can. There is plenty of room in the back for passengers too, so as a family car this thing does well. The Estate of course would have been a more practical choice, but people in Britain have always been a bit funny about Estates, especially in the last 2 decades. I absolutely love the Estate car, but sadly they've been dropped in favour of crossovers, which are just as big but have nowhere near as much room in them. There are some other innovative features in here too, like the advanced speed limiter. How that works is you get to about 75 mile an hour on the display, which is a real world 70, and then the steering wheel will simply start shaking itself to pieces, meaning you have to slow down a little bit. It is very comfy over long distances. I drove this car all the way back from Scotland, and because of conditions at the moment, I had to pretty much do it in one hit without really stopping. And actually, it's a good car to do that in. Oh, alright. The nice number plate on it. Once you have it above about 2000 RPM, this engine becomes considerably more cooperative. It quietens down and that sort of very tappety injectory noise goes away, and it does actually start to pull. Below that, it's got nothing, and I don't mean very little, I mean nothing. I'm at 1800 RPM now, foot flat to the floor, 55, 56, 60, and now she's got to 2000 RPM, she's starting to pull. It's not good. It's not quick. You could get caught out with this car very easily. The brakes are okay. They do require a firm push to get them to actually bring you to a stop. In a car like a 911, I would say it's a good thing, because I like brake pedals that require some force to really stop you, so you can modulate them nicely and precisely. Very handy when conditions work against you, like they are today. Looks alright out there, I know, but it's very cold and greasy. However, in this car, I think that squishy brake pedal is more a result of brake fluid that's now probably more water than brake fluid. Surprisingly, you can actually heel and toe in it. Oh yes, you can. There is, I'm sure entirely unsurprisingly, absolutely no reward whatsoever for revving this car out to its 5000 RPM redline, but it does actually go all the way. Some diesels of this type really have no interest in going anywhere near their purported redlines, but this one will. This one will do it. There is basic traction control available in here too, and let's give the turning circle a test. Not great, not terrible. Materials quality in here is generally fairly low. You got sort of vinyl and plastic and stuff everywhere, and anybody looking at a BMW at the time I don't think would have been interested in the Toyota, because it does feel like a step down. However, beyond the rogue bits of trim that have come away, it's actually held together fairly well, and I don't think that's entirely the car's fault. I do recall one day coming to drive this and there was a tree in the back. And I don't mean like someone had put a little pot plant on the rear seat. No. There was a branch in the car where someone had shut the door on the tree. So when I pulled away, the car tried to bring the hedgerow with it. That was a very interesting noise that made. The sound of a hedge going, "Ah, what are you doing, you madman? Get off!" In any decent world, this should be a car which still has some real tangible value, because it still works, it still drives, it still goes, it's still smooth, it's got life left in it. This really isn't a car that should be ready for the scrap heap. However, a combination of things have conspired to make this an almost entirely unsellable car. People don't want saloons anymore. People definitely don't want diesels anymore, and if they did, I don't think they'd want this diesel. People much tend to prefer to pay hundreds of pounds a month on a lease deal for a car they barely use, rather than spend hundreds of pounds to simply buy a car which will work. They instead will look at the fact that, yes, it did cost me £300 to stop it leaking the other day, but that's probably never ever going to have to be fixed again. And people worry about that kind of stuff rather than the fact that they've got depreciating assets that are going to cost them a fortune regardless of whether they use it or not. In many cities, owning a diesel of this vintage has now become very, very untrendy indeed, and that's one of the motivations behind Esther's family getting rid of this car, because They live in London, and their house is just inside what's going to become the ULEZ zone, meaning that every time they wanted to take this out, they're going to have to pay £12.50 or whatever it is for the privilege. And that means that this car's position on the driveway is therefore untenable. The original purpose of bringing this car back down to England was the fact that we were going to do something reasonably charitable with it. A friend of a friend was in dire need of cheap transportation, so we thought that this would fit the bill and serve a nice quiet retirement for it. However, it turns out that this is now a car that is so entirely undesirable that even somebody who cannot afford to fix their own car didn't want it for free. Which means it's now stuck on my driveway till I can find some poor sucker to take it on. And I don't know where I'm going to get one of those. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye-bye.
So that's why it doesn't turn over. What does he want? Hello, JayEmm. How are you?